Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Bob Levels Review. Bob Levels is a campaign series by Tim, should have been Todd, and when we talk about reviewing a satire piece comedy project like the Bob Levels, you're already at such an absurd crossing that you really need to acknowledge how absurd that is, and then just try and truck onward. Because, realistically speaking, how can anybody take this campaign seriously when it doesn't take itself seriously? And I agree with that. I agree with that in principle, or at least on face value. So why would you review something that doesn't take itself seriously? Well, I don't know. Why do I review anything that I review? Really, if you look at the argument of taking yourself seriously as a sort of precedent for whether or not you yourself as an audience should take something seriously. You as a player, you as a gamer, as the Bob Levels referred to us as. It doesn't necessarily make a whole lot of sense, but a lot of projects don't take themselves seriously. They just like to think that they do. At least that's my psychotic interpretation. Sorry, I looked at my YouTube history, and I see that I have uploaded Psychosis, so there you go. That's great. So I'm looking through the Bob Levels, the videos, and the experiences that we have all shared together. And I think that Todd, aka Tim, has given us something special with the Bob Levels. Indeed, this is actually one of the projects I cited in my now deleted interview with Jay Marino. As alongside Antioch, it was one of the campaigns that gave me a lot of inspiration when I was an adolescent. And when I was still forming my sort of standards that are then kept away from projects like Arcane, about, what a campaign should be about. How should you construct a project? And what should your goals be? I wish that I had analyzed the Bob Levels a little bit sooner than now, because I feel like, especially when I was working on comedic stuff like my brother's birthday projects every year, which are always at the beginning of the year with January, I would have been able to more immediately tap into the mindset of a campaign designer who's creating a comedic project. But I can still pretty easily get back into that headspace, and especially looking at the Bob Levels, I feel like I will have some insightful commentary and critique regarding this particular project. Now, we have to, like I said, acknowledge how absurd it is that we are reviewing something that not only doesn't take itself seriously, but doesn't expect anybody to take it seriously, isn't marketed as a serious project, obviously is meant to be a satire and, a comedy. It's meant to make you laugh and maybe cringe more so than it is meant to make you, hyped up and to deliver a very satisfying story. But I disagree with that last part of it, I think. I think that really what you should try to do with any story is you should have like a story, for one, I think, that augments the comedy to begin with. And a lot of the jokes that were in the Bob Levels, yes, some of them were actually scripted jokes, which means it's a step up from like Scary Movie or whatever the spoof movies that exist these days are called. Epic Movie and Date Movie and whatever. Those are more so like, they try to spoof things, and they don't really have any story or substance of their own to offer. But the Bob Levels lacks in that department greatly as well. It's just a little bit less so than those movies, and that's why I wanted to draw the comparison, because actually they're pretty similar in some of the terms of, like, well, what's wrong with them? I watched a review from Red Letter Media recently about Top Secret, which was released on the 14th of February, and this, their review was, not the movie. The 14th of February of this year is when Red Alert Media released that video. I'll link it in the description if I can remember. So the point of me bringing that up is because they actually were talking about a lot of the flaws of spoof movies, and I felt like a lot of those issues were actually sort of like the stars had aligned and the simulation had coded out one final message to me. Review the Bob Levels. Tell them what you think. Yeah, because like this is basically the same thing as sort of what they were doing, except they were also, mentioning that stuff in service to a review for a superior product in their eyes. So it's a little bit different here because I'm not like offering anything as an alternative, really. But I did want to point out a lot of the issues that we had where I feel like even Tim himself, yeah, he's just called Bob, no, fuck it. Even Bob himself found out that there were issues. Like, he seemed to understand it, how silly some of the stuff was, and not necessarily in an endearing way or in a way that lended positively to his campaigns and their quality levels. When he talks about Ian the Interceptor being terrible and he retires him. Like that could actually be a funny premise. I think that is actually a pretty funny premise. But the problem is that the player is probably torn between giving a fuck about Ian because they don't give a fuck about him because he was never funny. He even says he was never funny, but like that's the thing is like the biggest issue with critiquing anything like that's this level of satire or comedy or whatever is that unfortunately the designer and anybody who is an advocate for the project would immediately end up saying something to the effect of, well, maybe it was intentional that it was that bad, or maybe it was intentional that they were, yes, he made him unfunny to begin with, and he made it uncomfortable and cringy to begin with because that was the intended reaction. And I guess if that's the case, then this nullifies the critique because I am saying that was probably not the intention of the author in this case. If that was the intention of the author, then he succeeded, and he knows where to find me. But when it comes to I'm assuming that he wanted to make people laugh more so than he wanted to make people cringe and uncomfortable. Now, I don't understand where you would say Ian the Interceptor is like a spoof on people's briefings. Like, maybe you could make an argument that what it's actually a spoof of is really long briefings. But I can't imagine that it's meant to satirize anything in particular about briefing construction, because nobody ever really has after briefing scenes. Not since the Bob Levels, actually. Bob Levels was the first one to do it, and maybe there were some that lifted it, like the Gas series by Jim_Raynor, aka Church, is something that I found out by playing the Bob Levels. Actually just copied stuff 1-to-1. Which was so insane to me. Like, I can't believe that I got destroyed by that person into thinking that they were coming up with all of this insanity on their own, when then in fact they just copied this. So that's pretty insane. Maybe that was a deep satire in and of itself. By copying the Bob Levels, even when we say we can't copy the Bob Levels in a dialogue line, we're actually satirizing the fact that everybody copies from everybody else, just like Laconius waking up in a cold sweat because I may have copied a briefing of his or something. That's some real sick shit. But that's the sort of trifle that you have as a reviewer or a critiquer, a critic, an English speaker, is that you get into a position where you're supposed to be reviewing stuff and providing analysis and commentary, and part of that is why people come to your channel and watch your videos, and part of that is why you yourself do it, because you think that there's some value in offering that sort of critique and analysis. Obviously, a lot of it is also just me screaming and you guys laughing at that, but some of it is people interested in what I have to say when it comes to these reviews. Otherwise, they wouldn't have any views, obviously. So there's something to be said about whether or not you should even bother reviewing something like the Bob Levels, especially if the author, and I'm not accusing Bob, aka Tim, aka Todd, of this. I'm just saying that is an easy fallback position for somebody who doesn't really have any attachment to it anymore, of saying, oh yeah, well, that was the point. The point was it's bad. That's the point. It's bad. But it is bad. And that's sort of the issue. I think the Bob Levels shows you what happens if you take a project, you take a story, and you don't really bother with the story, and the plot doesn't even really hold up to itself. And really what you're after is you just want an excuse to make jokes. I'm like, that's okay. Like, that's a premise, if that's what you want to do. But I think if you actually want a comedic project, even if your goal is to satirize stuff, I think you can make it, self-serving. You can make the project work and justify itself, as long as you're also, like, the characters are memorable and enjoyable, and you care about their interactions, and you want to see them succeed, like a real movie, quote unquote. When I was working on my own comedy projects, at some point I transitioned into the idea of film comedy. I thought, like, okay, well, usually there's not really spoof comedy in films. Like, again, obviously there were a lot that were very recent, but historically, before like the 2000s, there weren't too many spoof comedy films. So I was more so interested in, like, what does an actual comedy film look like? I know they're really bad as well, but Adam Sandler movies as an example, like, those aren't usually spoof comedy. Maybe they like dip their toes into it recently, but if you just look at like a comedy where the point is, it's a happy ending or something, and it's a lighthearted tone, and there's lots of jokes and stuff, scripted jokes to make people endeared towards characters. Like, oh, maybe that is one way to take it. But even if you were to look at spoof comedies from like the 80s and 90s, or even the 70s, I think there was one in the 70s. Like, there are some that exist out there that are not like the Bob Levels, that actually have a plot you can follow and a set of stories or characters rather that interact with each other in a meaningful ways and actually have character growth. And even if you don't want to have character growth, you don't want to focus on that stuff, I think making it so that the characters are the central point at which the comedy revolves around, that can be your ticket to success in a lot of cases, because of the fact that you as the author are writing these characters into funny situations and giving them funny personalities. The jokes essentially write themselves. Yes, you can go in and write some really heavily constructed material, but if you just write the situations and you have characters that can turn situations, no matter how mundane or goofy or silly, into funny endeavors and stuff like that will work for you. That will do the job for you. And it's more so about the characters than it is about the plot. And so you can still have your silly jokes, your one-off jokes about the plot not really existing or barely existing, as was seen in the first episode particularly. But you can also actually have characters that carry the production and provide you with some humor. And so I'm not really sure what to make of the overall experience of the Bob levels. It was definitely not, as Sharklastic commented, epioc with a backslash. But it was illuminating for me as a developer myself. I do prefer the idea of comedy projects, comedy projects, to the film comedy stuff. Like I mentioned, I was really just grappling with that idea because I wasn't sure how to approach the spoof comedy stuff without it seeming like it was all just a joke. And I didn't want to just fall back on the excuse of it's a satire or it's a spoof comedy just because people had some legitimate issues with the production. At the same time, I don't think that you can critique something that's meant to be spoof comedy, that's meant to be satire, the same way you can critique something that's serious, because it by definition doesn't take itself seriously, and so the plot doesn't necessarily have its own set of elements that you're supposed to take seriously. So why would you critique it the same way? But at the same time, I think if characters are falling apart on a critical level, when you offer critical commentary about the characters and they don't hold up under critical examination, that is an issue. That is a point where you are... I think you've failed as the author to write characters that hold up, that have a sense of consistency about them, that will allow the audience to attach themselves to them. And so that's where I think that the lack of a serious tone to the development of the Bob levels probably bit it in the ass at the end of the day. At the same time, I do recognize that this is one of the earliest campaigns by Todd, by anybody in the scene. Is one of the earliest campaigns out there from I think 1998 to 2000 maybe, and it was just it's an old project, and people weren't necessarily in the business of trying to be elite level hobbyists, which is obviously just absurd and prime material for spoof comedy. But at the same time, I do think that if you were trying to be a modern day developer and you wanted to make a comedy project, the lesson that you can take from the Bob levels is that the characters have to carry the production, generally speaking. And so I would definitely recommend people take a second look at the Bob levels and say, why didn't some of this humor work out? And was it that the situations themselves weren't funny? No, I think like cloning heroes and stuff like that is pretty goofy because people use hero units in their maps for reasons that they're not supposed to. So you can say that that's a spoof comedy of that. And just in general, it's a funny-ish situation to be in. So, I can see where humor could be derived from that premise as a result of including funny characters in that area and saying, hey, here's, we're dropping you into these situations. Here you go. Make some humor. But at the same time, it's like, the maps themselves aren't really great to play from a gameplay sense. So that falls apart from the enjoyment level pretty, it detracts from the enjoyment that the player is going to have. And I think that's a big deal. At the same time, there's not really much else to say about the characters. I feel like a lot of them were one note, and maybe it's my fault. Maybe that's more so an issue with me because I was with Gas a lot in helping Church develop Gas, and they had an Archon hero that was called Doug Vinny, so it was like similar to Jake Larry, like lifted 1-to-1 again, and they didn't like each other. So like a lot of the characters ended up feeling very similar to each other. which is pretty embarrassing. Now that I think about it, that person's going to get reamed next time I talk to them. Holy shit, I can't believe that they copied everything from the Bob levels. Why, Bob? Why? Oh, fuck. So I guess that's the end of the review for the Bob levels, man. I hope you guys had a good time at the very least. And if you are looking to derive something valuable from the analysis of the Bob levels, I would just look at the characters, figure out what they could have done to make these potentially comedic premises work much better than they ended up working. And then maybe look at the stuff that worked for you, that gave you a chuckle, that made you laugh, and see like, okay, how could I take that further? You know, if that's something you're interested in. If not, just stick around for the ride. We'll be back with more content soon.